In the dim corridors of ancient memory, where the whispers of forgotten civilizations echo through time, there lies a tale that has haunted the minds of scholars and dreamers alike for millennia. Imagine a vast island empire, risen from the sea's embrace, its towers gleaming under a sun that seemed to favor its people above all others. This is the story of Atlantis, not as a mere fable spun from idle imagination, but as a shadow cast by the words of one of history's greatest thinkers, Plato. He spoke of it not in jest, but as a solemn inheritance from elders long gone, a narrative passed down through generations like a guarded secret. As we embark on this journey, let us tread softly, for what begins as a distant legend may reveal threads woven into the very fabric of our world's past. Listen closely, and you may sense the faint tremor of truths buried beneath waves that have long since calmed. Plato, the philosopher whose ideas shaped the Western world, introduced Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. These were no fanciful tales. They were presented as historical accounts, relayed through a chain of reliable voices. The story begins with Solon, the wise Athenian lawgiver, who traveled to Egypt in the 6th century BCE. There, in the ancient city of Sais, he encountered priests of the goddess Neith, guardians of records etched in stone and papyrus that stretch back thousands of years. These priests, with their serene demeanor and vast knowledge, shared with Solon a chronicle of events from a time when the gods still walked among men, dividing the earth into realms. It was here that Solon learned of Athens' ancient glory, a city that stood as a beacon of virtue against a formidable foe from beyond the known world. But why would such a story be preserved in Egypt, of all places? The priests explained that their land, blessed by the Nile's eternal flow, had escaped the cataclysms that erased so much of human history elsewhere. As Solon absorbed their words, he felt the weight of forgotten heroism, a narrative that would one day find its way to Plato through his ancestor Critias. Critias, Plato's great-grandfather, recounted this tale at a gathering of intellectuals, where discussions of ideal societies naturally led to reflections on real ones that had risen and fallen. He described how the Egyptian priests spoke of a cycle of destructions, great floods and fires that periodically cleansed the earth, leaving only fragments of memory in the survivors. In one such era, 9,000 years before Solon's visit, there existed a power that dwarfed the imaginations of even the mightiest Greek city-states. This was Atlantis, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a realm born from the union of Poseidon, the god of the sea, and a mortal woman named Cleito. Poseidon, enamored with her, enclosed her hilltop home with concentric rings of water and land, creating a natural fortress that blended divine ingenuity with earthly beauty. From their descendants sprang a line of kings who ruled with wisdom and might, expanding their domain across oceans and continents. Yet, as Critias hinted, this splendor carried the seeds of its own undoing, a moral decay that would invite divine retribution. The geography of Atlantis, as detailed by the priests, paints a picture of engineered perfection. At its center stood a magnificent acropolis, surrounded by alternating moats and earthen walls, each adorned with metals that symbolized the god's favor. The outermost wall coated in brass, the next in tin, and the innermost in orichalcum, a fiery red metal lost to modern knowledge. Bridges spanned these waterways, allowing passage for ships and citizens alike, while vast harbors bustled with vessels from distant lands. The island's plains were fertile beyond measure, irrigated by a network of canals that drew water from mountain springs and hot springs alike. Elephants roamed its forests, a detail that evokes images of exotic abundance, and its people harvested 2 crops a year, thanks to the mild climate and ingenious agriculture. Temples dedicated to Poseidon rose high, their interiors lined with gold and ivory, housing statues that depicted the god in his chariot, drawn by winged horses. This was no chaotic wilderness, but a symphony of human achievement, where laws inscribed on orichalcum pillars guided a society of 10 kingdoms, each led by descendants of Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon. As the Atlanteans prospered, their influence spread like ripples across the sea. They established colonies in Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, ancient Etruria, and in Africa up to the borders of Egypt. Their navy was unparalleled, with 1,200 warships ready to enforce their will. The kings met every 5 or 6 years in the Temple of Poseidon, sacrificing bulls in rituals that bound them in unity and justice. They drank the blood of the sacrificed animal mixed with wine, swearing oaths to uphold the ancient laws. But beneath this veneer of harmony, Critias subtly warned, lurked the potential for hubris. The Atlanteans, once noble and attuned to the divine, began to covet more than their allotted share, their ambitions turning toward conquest. It was this overreach that set them on a collision course with nascent Athens, a city founded by Athena herself, embodying wisdom and restraint. The priests told Solon that Athens, in those primordial days, was a land of heroes, its soil rich and its people virtuous, living in harmony with nature and each other. Athens, as described, was a marvel in its own right, though more modest than Atlantis. Its acropolis was larger than, crowned with temples and surrounded by groves of olive trees, sacred to Athena. The warriors of Athens were divided into classes, with guardians dwelling on the heights, ever vigilant. Springs provided pure water, and the climate was temperate, free from extremes. This idyllic setting was no accident. It was the gods' design, a counterpoint to the opulence of Atlantis. When the Atlanteans launched their invasion, seeking to enslave the entire Mediterranean, it was Athens that stood alone against the tide. The other Greek states had fallen or submitted, but Athens' hoplites, armed with bronze and unyielding resolve, repelled the onslaught. In a great battle, they shattered the Atlantean forces, liberating the oppressed and halting the empire's advance. Yet, victory came at a cost, and the priest's account leaves us pondering the fragility of even the greatest civilizations. For soon after, a cataclysm struck, earthquakes and floods that swallowed Atlantis in a single day and night, erasing it from the map as if the sea itself had reclaimed its own. Plato's purpose in recounting this, scholars have long debated, was perhaps more philosophical than historical. He used Atlantis as a foil to his ideal republic, illustrating how even a divinely ordained society could falter when virtue waned. The Atlanteans, initially blessed with a balanced constitution, kings ruling with counsel from the gods, degenerated into tyrants, their greed offending Zeus. In a council of the gods, the king of Olympus decreed their punishment, unleashing natural forces that sank the island into the abyss. This moral arc resonates with Greek thought, where hybris invites nemesis. But was Plato drawing from real events? The timeline he provides, 9,000 years before Solon, places Atlantis around 9600 BC, a period when human civilization was just emerging from the Ice Age. Archaeological evidence from that era is sparse, but hints of advanced societies exist, like the submerged ruins off the coasts of various continents, whispering possibilities. As we delve deeper, one wonders if the waves that hide Atlantis also conceal echoes of our own forgotten origins. The Egyptian connection adds layers of intrigue. Why would priests and sages possess such knowledge? Egypt's antiquity was legendary even to the Greeks. Herodotus, writing a century before Plato, marveled at their records spanning thousands of years. The Temple of Neith, equated with Athena, served as a bridge between cultures, suggesting shared myths or migrations. Perhaps Solon, seeking wisdom to reform Athens, encountered tales of ancient deluges common in Mesopotamian lore, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where floods punish humanity's excesses. These parallels invite us to consider Atlantis not as invention, but as a Hellenized version of older traditions passed along trade routes from the Nile to the Aegean. Critias claims the story was preserved in Solon's notes, translated and handed down, yet incomplete. Plato's Critias dialogue breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the war's details tantalizingly unresolved. This abruptness mirrors the legend itself, a narrative submerged before its climax, compelling us to imagine what might have been. Venturing beyond Plato, historians have sought real-world inspirations for Atlantis. The Minoan civilization, flourishing on Crete from 3000 to 1450 BC, bears striking similarities. Their palaces, like Knossos, featured advanced plumbing, frescoes of bulls, and thalassocracy, see empire, that dominated the Mediterranean. A catastrophic volcanic eruption on Thera, Santorini, around 1600 BC, devastated the region, triggering tsunamis that may have wiped out coastal settlements. Ash layers and pumice deposits attest to the event's scale, echoing Plato's description of earthquakes and inundations. The Minoan sudden decline, once attributed to invaders, now links to this natural disaster, their vibrant culture vanishing almost overnight. Could this be the kernel of truth behind Atlantis? The timeline doesn't match perfectly. Plato's date is far earlier, but oral traditions often compress or exaggerate eras. As we ponder these connections, the island of Crete emerges as a shadowy prototype, its ruins a testament to how quickly glory can turn to dust. Yet Atlantis eludes easy explanation, its allure lying the gaps between fact and legend. Ancient writers after Plato, like Diodorus Siculus, mentioned similar lost lands, while geographers speculated on continents beyond the Atlantic. The name itself, derived from Atlas, who held the sky, evokes the Western Ocean, where explorers like Pytheas of Massalia ventured in the 4th century BCE, reporting vast seas and mysterious islands. In this vast expanse, where currents carry secrets from afar, one can't help but feel the pull of undiscovered history. As the sun sets on this first chapter, the waves murmur of greater revelations to come, of wars fought in the dawn of time and civilizations that challenge the gods themselves. The story of Atlantis is just beginning to unfold, layer by layer, inviting you to linger in its depths a while longer. The echoes of that ancient battle lingered in the minds of the Egyptian priests, preserved not merely as history, but as a cautionary mirror held up to every succeeding generation. Solon, listening intently beneath the temple colonnades where incense drifted lazily in the warm air, felt the story settle into him like sediment at the bottom of a still pool. The priests spoke slowly, choosing their words with the care of those who knew that some truths, once released, could never be recalled. They described how the Atlanteans, having subdued much of the known world, turned their gaze toward the lands that remained free. Their fleets darkened the horizon, their banners rippling with symbols of Poseidon's trident and the golden bull. Cities fell before them not always by force of arms, but by the sheer weight of their presence, an empire so vast it seemed inevitable. Yet Athens, small and resolute, refused to bend. Its people, guided by the wisdom of Athena, had built not only walls of stone, but walls of character. When the invaders landed on the shores near what would one day become the plain of Attica, they expected submission. Instead, they met disciplined ranks of spearmen who fought not for plunder, but for something deeper, the right to live without a foreign yoke. The confrontation unfolded across a landscape that no longer exists in quite the same form. The priests recounted how the earth itself seemed to take sides. Mountains that once stood sentinel over fertile valleys trembled and cracked. Rivers reversed their courses in sudden fury. The sky grew heavy with ash and storm. In the midst of this chaos, the Athenian warriors pressed forward, their bronze shields locked in a wall that no Atlantean phalanx could break. Day after day the battle raged, until the invaders, exhausted and bewildered by the ferocity of their opponents, began to falter. Then came the decisive moment. A great tremor shook the ground beneath the Atlantean camp. Fissures opened like wounds in the earth. The sea, which had always been their ally, now turned against them. Waves rose higher than the tallest masts, sweeping ships from their moorings and dragging men into the depths. The priests' voices grew quieter here, as though the memory itself carried a residue of awe. Athens stood victorious, but the victory was shadowed. Many of her bravest had fallen. The land lay scarred. And yet the greater catastrophe was yet to come, not upon the battlefield, but upon the very heart of the enemy's power. Back on their island, the Atlanteans returned in disarray, their confidence shaken for the first time. The concentric harbors, once filled with the proud vessels of 1,000 voyages, now held broken hulls and silence. The kings gathered once more in the great temple, but the old rituals fell hollow. The bulls sacrificed no longer seemed to carry divine approval. The orichalcum pillars, inscribed with laws handed down from Poseidon himself, reflected faces grown hard and calculating. What had begun as righteous dominion had twisted into something colder. The desire to possess everything, to leave nothing unconquered. Zeus, watching from his high seat, saw the corruption spreading like rot through once noble wood. The gods convened. Words were spoken that no mortal would ever hear in full. Then the decision was made. Not a slow decline, not a gradual fading, but a swift and final judgment. The island that had risen through divine favor would sink through divine displeasure. The cataclysm began without warning. First came the earthquakes, deep, rolling shocks that seemed to originate from the very roots of the world. Towers of marble and gold swayed like reeds in the wind. Walls built to last forever cracked and crumbled. The people ran into the streets, calling upon Poseidon to spare them, forgetting perhaps that it was Poseidon's own father who now wielded the punishment. Then the sea answered, not with gentle tides, but with a surge that lifted entire districts and carried them away. The concentric rings of water, so carefully engineered, became instruments of destruction. Water poured over walls, flooded temples, drowned palaces. Hot springs that had once soothed weary limbs now boiled upward in guises of steam and sulfur. Flames erupted where lightning struck fallen structures. In a single day and a single night of misfortune, as Plato would later phrase it, the entire island disappeared beneath the waves. Nothing remained above the surface but mud and memory. The sea closed over it, smooth and indifferent, as though it had never been. For centuries afterward, sailors spoke in hushed tones of a place where the water sometimes grew strangely warm, where strange lights flickered beneath the surface on moonless nights. Fishermen hauled up nets tangled with fragments of worked stone or pieces of red-hued metal that no forge on earth could reproduce. Yet no one dared dive too deep. The priests of Sais believed the site had been sealed by divine decree, a warning to any who might seek to rebuild what had been destroyed. Solon carried this knowledge back to Athens, intending to weave it into the fabric of his reforms, to remind his fellow citizens that greatness without virtue invites ruin. He began to write it down, translating the Egyptian tale into Greek verse, but death overtook him before the work was finished. The unfinished manuscript passed to Dropides, his friend, and from Dropides to Critias the elder, and from him to Critias the younger, Plato's great-grandfather. Each generation preserved it, adding their own reflections, yet always aware that something essential remained unspoken, some detail withheld by time or by the gods themselves. When Critias the younger shared the story at that famous symposium, the listeners sat in thoughtful silence. Socrates, ever probing, asked gentle questions that drew out further details. Hermocrates, the Syracusan general, nodded in recognition, for tales of lost western lands circulated even in Sicily. Yet the account remained incomplete. The Critias dialogue breaks off just as a description of the war's final stages begins, almost as though the storyteller himself hesitated at the edge of revelation. Plato never completed the third dialogue he had planned, leaving the fate of Atlantis suspended, half revealed. Scholars have puzzled over this for generations. Was it deliberate? Did Plato intend the abrupt ending to mirror the sudden end of the island itself? Or did death or distraction interrupt his work? Whatever the reason, the silence of the story's close has only deepened its power, drawing seekers across the centuries to peer into the same abyss. The search for physical traces has never ceased. In the centuries after Plato, geographers and historians speculated about islands in the Western Ocean. Strabo and Pliny mention submerged lands off the coast of Spain. Later, during the age of exploration, cartographers sometimes marked Atlantis on their maps, placing it somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, a ghostly placeholder for the unknown. When Columbus sailed west, some whispered that he might rediscover the lost continent. Instead, he found new worlds, but the dream persisted. In the 19th century, Ignatius Donnelly revived serious interest with his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, arguing that many flood myths across cultures, from the biblical deluge to the Mesoamerican tales, pointed to a single historical catastrophe. He suggested that survivors of Atlantis had seeded civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas, carrying with them knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and architecture. Modern science has approached the question with greater caution, yet intriguing clues continue to surface. Submerged structures off the coast of Cuba, detected by sonar in deep water, show symmetrical arrangements that some interpret as artificial. The Yonaguni Monument near Japan, with its stepped terraces and right angles, lies beneath the sea and dates to a time when sea levels were far lower. In the Bahamas, so-called Bimini Road consists of large rectangular stones aligned in a pattern that resembles a harbor wall. Carbon dating places many of these features thousands of years before Plato's supposed date. Yet their existence raises quiet questions. Could oral tradition have preserved a memory far older than any written record? Could the 9,000 years be symbolic or miscounted by generations? The more we learn about the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers raised sea levels by over 400 feet, the more plausible it becomes that entire coastal societies vanished beneath the rising waters, leaving only legends in their wake. As the current of time carries us onward, the story of Atlantis refuses to settle into neat explanation. It hovers between myth and memory, between philosophy and archaeology, between what was and what might have been. The island may lie silent 2 miles beneath the Atlantic, its spires broken, its gardens choked with sediment, yet its voice still reaches us across the centuries. It speaks of hubris and humility, of divine gifts squandered, of a moment when humanity stood at the pinnacle of achievement and then fell. And somewhere in that fall lies a truth we have not yet fully grasped, a truth that Plato, through the priests, through Solon, through Critias, sought to pass on before it too was swallowed by oblivion. The waters are deep, the night is long, and the tale is far from finished. The silence that followed the island's disappearance was not empty. It carried a weight, a kind of hush that settles over places where great violence has occurred and then been erased. Mariners crossing the Atlantic in the centuries that followed reported odd phenomena. Sudden calms where the wind simply ceased, waters that glowed faintly in the dark, patches of sea so thick with seaweed that ships became entangled for hours. Some claimed to hear distant bells tolling beneath the surface, as though submerged temples still rang their summons at the appointed hours. These were sailors' tales, easily dismissed, yet they persisted across generations, carried from port to port like driftwood that refuses to sink. In the libraries of Alexandria, scholars copied and recopied the fragments Plato had left behind, debating whether the story was allegory, history thinly veiled, or something stranger still, a memory so old it had outlived its own language. One thread that refuses to break is a question of orichalcum, that mysterious metal Plato describes as flashing like fire, second only to gold in value. The priest of Sais told Solon it was mined in great quantities from the mountains of Atlantis itself. When the island vanished, so did the source. No known deposit of orichalcum has ever been identified with certainty, though some modern metallurgists point to alloys of copper and zinc, or perhaps an auric copper rich in arsenic that produces a reddish sheen. Ancient texts from other cultures speak of similar substances, the red gold of the Hittites, the mountain copper of certain Andean peoples, the electrum-like alloys prized in early Egypt. Could these be echoes of the same lost resource? Or was orichalcum never a single metal at all, but a symbolic term for a technology or a craft now forgotten? The very name, mountain copper, suggests extraction from high places, places that might once have stood above the waves before the waters rose at the end of the Ice Age. That rise in sea level provides one of the quietest yet most persistent clues. Between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 BC, global oceans climbed by more than 120 meters as continental ice sheets melted. Coastlines retreated kilometers in some regions, submerging vast plains where early human settlements may have thrived. The Persian Gulf was once dry land, a fertile river valley. The North Sea floor held Doggerland, a land bridge connecting Britain to Europe, dotted with Mesolithic campsites now lying 30 to 50 meters underwater. Along the eastern seaboard of North America, ancient river channels extend far out onto what is now continental shelf, their banks lined with stone tools and hearths dated to before the flood. If a sophisticated coastal culture existed during this transitional epoch, possessing metallurgy, monumental architecture, and maritime capability, it would have been among the first and hardest hit by the inundation. Survivors, fleeing inland or to higher ground, would have carried stories of a drowned homeland, stories that could easily have been embellished with divine wrath and heroic resistance as they passed from tongue to tongue. Plato's date of 9,000 years before Solon, roughly 9,600 BC, falls squarely within this window of rapid change. It is close to the age assigned to Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where massive T-shaped pillars were erected by hunter-gatherers who, according to current understanding, should not yet have possessed the social organization required for such work. The site's carvings depict animals, abstract symbols, and what some interpret as celestial markers. Its sudden appearance, fully formed, followed by deliberate burial a millennium later, has led a few researchers to wonder whether it represents a cultural memory of something even older, something lost when the world's shorelines drowned. Similar anomalies appear elsewhere. The underwater structures at Yanaguni, their clean angles softened by millennia of currents. The submerged megaliths off India's Gulf of Cambay, dated by some over 9,000 years. The Bimini Formation in Bahamas, whose rectangular blocks align with uncanny precision. Mainstream archaeology attributes most of these to natural geology, fractured beach rock, wave-cut platforms. Yet the alignments and scale continue to invite questions that will not be silenced. The Minoan parallel, already touched upon, grows stronger the closer one looks. The eruption of Thera was not merely a volcanic event. It was a chain reaction. The caldera collapse generated tsunamis that reached Crete within minutes, waves 30 to 40 meters high smashing into coastal palaces and harbors. Ashfall poisoned fields and cisterns. Trade networks unraveled. The once dominant Minoan thalassocracy weakened, leaving room for Mycenaean influence to rise. Linear A, their undeciphered script, fell silent. Bull-leaping frescoes and marine motifs vanished from pottery. If this catastrophe was folded into older memories of Ice Age flooding, the resulting legend could easily have acquired the grandeur Plato describes, an entire continent-sized island rather than a single volcanic isle, a war against continental Greece rather than regional rivalry, a divine punishment rather than plate tectonics. Oral tradition is not a precise recorder. It is a sculptor, shaping raw events into forms that carry moral weight across generations. Beyond the Mediterranean, flood myths appear with striking consistency. The Sumerian king list speaks of a deluge that ended the antediluvian age. The Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh tablet describe a boat built to preserve life from waters sent by the gods. In Mesoamerica, the Maya Popol Vuh and Aztec codices recount worlds destroyed by flood before the present creation. The Vedic texts of India tell of Manu, worn by a fish avatar Vishnu, building a vessel to survive the cosmic inundation. China's great flood under Emperor Yao forced the Great to dredge channels and found a new dynasty. These cannot all derive from a single Near Eastern source. Their distribution suggests either independent observations of local catastrophes or a shared memory of a global event too vast for any one culture to encompass alone. Atlantis, in this light, becomes not an isolated Greek invention, but one regional expression of a near-universal trauma, the moment when the sea claimed the lands where humanity had first learned to build beyond mere survival. Plato, writing in the shadow of Athens' own imperial collapse after the Peloponnesian War, may have found in these ancient echoes a mirror for his city's recent excesses. The ideal state he outlines in a republic, balanced, virtuous, moderate, stands in deliberate contrast to the Atlantean trajectory, from harmony to greed, from divine favor to hubris, from dominion to obliteration. By placing the tale in the mouths of Egyptian priests, he gave an authority his audience would respect. By setting it 9,000 years in past, he removed it safely beyond verification. Yet the very incompleteness of the Critias dialogue, breaking off just as Zeus prepares to speak, suggests a deliberate withholding. Perhaps Plato believed some truths should remain half-glimpsed, like islands seen through fog, visible enough to stir reflection but never fully charted. As listeners in later ages returned to these pages, the story refused to lie still. Medieval cartographers sometimes sketched an Antilia or Attalia west of the Azores, a phantom drawn from sailors' reports of verdant lands glimpsed on the horizon. When the Portuguese reached the Cape Verde Islands and then Brazil, some chroniclers wondered aloud if they had brushed against the fringes of Plato's lost world. The Renaissance humanists, hungry for classical wisdom, debated whether Columbus had fulfilled an ancient prophecy by sailing toward Atlantis. Even in the Enlightenment, when reason sought to banish myth, figures like Buffon and Voltaire still entertained the possibility that submerged lands might one day yield proof. The question lingered. If Atlantis was fiction, why did it feel so real? And if it was real, why had no unmistakable trace survived? The answer may lie not in a single sunken continent, but in the cumulative weight of many drownings. Coastal cultures lost in meltwater pulses, volcanic archipelagos shattered, River valleys turned to bays. Each disaster left survivors who told their children of a time when the world was different, when the land stretched farther and the gods were closer. Over millennia, these tales merged, were refined, were given names and moral lessons. Atlantis became the most eloquent of them all because Plato gave it shape, language, and purpose. He did not invent the shadow on the water. He simply described its outline so clearly that every subsequent generation has seen its reflection in their own era's pride and peril. Now the night deepens further. The stars above shift their positions as they have for uncounted ages, indifferent to the cities that rise and fall beneath them. Somewhere beneath the cold Atlantic, in darkness unbroken since the day the island vanished, broken columns still stand, their inscriptions unreadable, their purpose forgotten. Yet the story they once told has not drowned. It has only descended, waiting in patient silence for those willing to listen long enough, to dive deep enough, to hear what the priest of Sais first whispered to a traveler from Athens so very long ago. The waters hold their breath. The tale continues to unfold, drawing us onward, one quiet revelation at a time. The deeper we descend into this narrative, the more the boundaries between what was remembered and what was imagined begin to soften, like mist rising from warm water at dawn. The priests in Sais had spoken to Solon of records kept on temple walls, hieroglyphs that chronicled not only kings and harvests, but also the comings and goings of entire peoples across seas now vanished beneath the horizon. They describe how, long before their own dynasties rose along the Nile, there had been other lands, fertile, populous, proud, where men built with stone and dreamed in metal. One such land, they said, had sent emissaries to Egypt in an age when the pyramids were yet unthought of concepts. These visitors brought gifts of orichalcum and tales of islands strung, like beads across an endless western ocean. The priests recorded their speech, measured their ships, noted the stars by which they navigated. Then came the time when no more ships arrived. The sea grew empty. The records noted only silence, followed later by vague reports of upheaval far to the west. Tremors felt even in Memphis, dust clouds that dimmed the sun for days. It was as though the world itself had exhaled sharply and then held its breath. Solon listened, and in the stillness between the priest's words, he began to sense the shape of something larger than a single catastrophe. The story of Atlantis was not merely the fall of one island. It was a closing of an entire chapter in human wanderings. Before the great inundation, the priest implied, the earth had been more generously apportioned to mankind. Plains now underwater had supported cities whose names no tongue remembered. Mountain ranges that once pierced the sky had served as way stations for caravans moving between continents now separated by water. The gods, they said, had once walked more freely among mortals, allotting territories with deliberate care. Poseidon received the sea and its islands, Zeus the mainland heights, Hades the unseen depths. Yet even divine divisions could be challenged when mortals grew forgetful of their place. The Atlanteans, having received the fairest portion, forgot the covenant. Their transgression was not war alone, but the belief that dominion could be absolute, that the sea and land alike were theirs to command without limit or gratitude. This theme of measured allotment runs quietly through so many ancient traditions. In Mesopotamia, the gods cast lots for heaven, earth, and underworld. In the Norse sagas, the world tree Yggdrasil holds 9 realms in careful balance. Among the Maya, the creator gods measured the 4 corners of the earth with cord before shaping humanity from maize. The idea recurs because it answers a primal anxiety. What happens when the balance is broken? Plato, through the Egyptian priests, offered one answer. When the Atlanteans crossed the line from stewardship to conquest, the gods withdrew their favor. The mechanism of withdrawal was natural, earthquake, flood, fire, but the cause was moral. Zeus did not hurl thunderbolts in rage. He simply allowed the island, once buoyed by divine protection, to sink under its own corrupted weight. The lesson was stark. No civilization, however advanced, however blessed, is exempt from consequence. Yet consequence rarely arrives without prelude. The priests hinted at warning signs ignored. Strange lights appeared in the western sky, perhaps auroral displays intensified by geomagnetic shifts at the end of the Ice Age. Springs that had always run clear began to taste of iron and sulfur. Birds abandoned their nesting cliffs en masse. The bulls in the sacred precincts grew restless, bellowing to the night as though sending danger long before men could name it. The kings, grown accustomed to interpreting every event as proof of their own greatness, dismissed these omens as trivial. They redoubled their sacrifices, gilded their temples more lavishly, sent expeditions farther afield to bring back rarities that might appease the gods. But the more they grasped, the emptier their hand became. The final council in Poseidon's temple, where the 10 kings drank the mingled blood and wine, was meant to renew their bond. Instead, it marked the moment when that bond snapped. The orichalcum pillars recorded their odes. The waves would soon erase them. After the island vanished, survivors, if any reached distant shores, would have carried fragments of the disaster with them. A few may have fled eastward, landing on the coast of what is now Portugal or Morocco, bringing stories of a drowned paradise in a city that stood against it. Others, sailing south or southwest, might have reached islands in the mid-Atlantic or even the eastern seaboard of a yet undiscovered continent. Linguistic traces are faint, but tantalizing. The Guanches, aboriginal inhabitants of the Canary Islands, preserved legends of homeland lost beneath the sea, a place called a tit or a titlan where their ancestors had lived in towers of red stone. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 15th century, the Guanches still practiced mummification, built step pyramids, and spoke a language unrelated to Berber or any known African tongue. Their oral histories described a great cataclysm that separated them from their kin. Coincidence? Perhaps. Yet the Canaries lie directly on the path a vessel fleeing a sinking mid-Atlantic island might take, carried by the same currents that later bore Columbus westward. Further echoes appear in unexpected places. The Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica, emerging around 1200 BCE, suddenly produced colossal basalt heads, intricate jade work, and a calendar of astonishing precision. Their iconography includes bearded figures and serpents that some interpret as memories of seafarers from afar. Across the Pacific, Polynesian voyagers navigated by stars and wave patterns over distances that stagger the modern mind. Their myths speak of ancestral homelands swallowed by water, of gods who raised islands from the deep only to reclaim them later. In the Andes, the Inca preserved tales of Viracocha, a white-robed teacher who arrived from the sea after a great flood, bringing laws and crafts before departing westward. These parallels do not prove contact. Correlation is not causation, but they illustrate how widely the motif of a drowned advanced culture spread. Each society told a story in its own idiom, yet the core remained. A golden age ended by water, survivors carrying seeds of knowledge to new lands. Modern oceanography has begun to map what once lay above the waves. During the last glacial maximum, sea level stood approximately 125 meters lower. The continental shelves, broad, shallow platforms fringing every coastline, were dry land, supporting rivers, forests, and human habitation. The Persian Gulf was a verdant valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates. The Sunda Shelf connected Sumatra, Java, and Borneo into a single landmass larger than India. The Sewell Shelf joined Australia to New Guinea and Tasmania. Along the Atlantic margin of Europe and Africa, a coastal plain extended dozens to hundreds of kilometers westward. If even a fraction of these now submerged lands hosted settled communities with metallurgy, monumental construction, or long-distance trade, their disappearance would have constituted a civilizational fracture. Memories of such places, carried by refugees moving inland or along new coastlines, could have seeded legends that eventually reached Plato through multiple channels. Phoenician mariners, Egyptian scribes, oral poets of the Aegean. The question that lingers, soft but persistent, is whether Atlantis represents one specific site or a composite portrait. Perhaps Plato drew from several sources. The Thera eruption for the suddenness of destruction, Minoan Crete for the maritime empire and bull rituals, older flood memories for moral framework, and reports of submerged lands from contemporary travelers. Or perhaps, and this possibility cannot yet be dismissed, a genuine memory of a lost Bronze Age or even pre-Bronze Age culture survived in Egyptian archives, transmitted across 3,000 years until it reached Athens. The date of 9,600 BCE aligns closely with the onset of the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial cold around 10,900 BCE, possibly triggered by a comet impact or massive freshwater discharge into the North Atlantic. The subsequent meltwater pulse 1A, around 9,500 BC, raised sea levels several meters within centuries. A coastal society caught in that window would have faced rapid, terrifying inundation, precisely the kind of event that could scar collective memory for millennia. As the hours lengthen and the voice of narration grows quieter still, the weight of these overlapping threads settles over us like silt on a sunken harbor. Atlantis refuses to resolve into simple fact or pure fiction. It exists instead in the tension between them, a shadow moving beneath the surface, visible only in certain lights at certain angles. We catch glimpses in sonar scans of the mid-Atlantic ridge, in pollen cores that record sudden forest clearance followed by flooding, in mists that agree on little except the water that ended them. Each clue is partial, each interpretation provisional, yet together they form something larger. Not proof of a continent lost, but evidence of how fragile even the most brilliant human achievement can be when set against the slow, inexorable rhythm of the earth itself. The story pauses here, suspended between revelation and mystery, inviting you to remain in its quiet current just a little longer, listening for the next faint echo rising from below. The way it was been lost presses gently downward now, like the slow accumulation of sediment over centuries, covering yet preserving. We have followed the thread from Plato's dialogues to the priest's ancient records, through the tremors of earth and sea that erase an empire, and into the scattered echoes that still reach across oceans and time. But the story does not end with disappearance. It continues in the quiet ways knowledge survives, carried in symbols etched on stone, in measurements repeated across unrelated cultures, in architectural forms that reappear long after their supposed origin should have been forgotten. These are the faint signals, the almost imperceptible ripples, that suggest Atlantis was not merely a warning but a source, a wellspring whose waters, though muddied by catastrophe, continued to nourish distant shores. Consider first the question of measurement and proportion. Plato describes the central plain of Atlantis as 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, roughly 555 by 370 kilometers, an entire island as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. The city itself was laid out with mathematical precision, concentric rings whose diameters increased in regular ratios, canals dug in straight lines, harbors engineered to exact specifications. Such obsessive regard for harmony and number was not unique to the Greeks. It appears earlier and farther afield. In the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa display grid-planned streets, standardized brick sizes, and sophisticated drainage systems that imply a deep understanding of geometry and hydraulics. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, with its watertight construction and precise dimensions, recalls the ritual bathing pools Plato ascribes to Poseidon's precinct. Coincidence? Possibly. Yet the sudden emergence of these cities around 2600 BC, fully formed with no clear developmental precursors in the region, has long puzzled archaeologists. Some have quietly wondered whether refugees or ideas from a drowned Western culture could have contributed to that leap. Further east still, in ancient China, the Xia dynasty, long considered legendary until recent discoveries, preserved traditions of a founder, Yu the Great, who tamed catastrophic floods by dredging channels and building dikes. The engineering feats attributed to him mirror the canal networks Plato describes on Atlantis, vast systems that irrigated plains, connected rivers to seas, and protected against inundation. Chinese texts speak of a time before the flood, when the land was richer, the climate milder, the harvests more abundant. After the deluge, you reorganized society around water control, establishing a precedent that shaped Chinese civilization for millennia. Intriguingly, some early astronomical alignments in China, such as those at Taosi, dated to around 2100 BCE, show knowledge of solstices and equinoxes that parallels techniques possibly used in Atlantean temple design. Again, no direct link exists, yet the recurrence of flood-taming heroes in geometric sacred spaces invites the thought that shared archetype, or perhaps a diffused technical tradition, may underlie them all. Across the Atlantic, in the Americas, the pattern grows more enigmatic. The oldest known monumental architecture in the Western Hemisphere belongs to Caral Soup in Peru, dating to approximately 2600 BC, contemporary with Egypt's Old Kingdom and the Indus cities. Caral features sunken plazas, stepped pyramids, and residential complexes arranged with apparent astronomical intent. No pottery, No metal weapons, no signs of warfare. Instead, evidence of sophisticated music, irrigation agriculture, and long-distance trade in cotton and keeper-like accounting devices. How did such complexity arise so early in a region previously thought to lag behind the Old World? Mainstream explanations point to local innovation under favorable environmental conditions. Yet the absence of clear antecedents, combined with myths among later Andean peoples of Viracocha arriving from the sea after a deluge to teach architecture, agriculture, and law, keeps the question alive. Similarly, the Olmec heartland along the Gulf of Mexico produced colossal heads, altar thrones, and early writing systems by 1200 BCE, with stylistic elements, feathered serpents, word jaguars, that some see as distantly reminiscent of bull cults and marine iconography from the eastern Mediterranean. Diffusionist theories remain controversial, but underwater archaeology continues to reveal submerged sites along the Yucatan and Caribbean coasts that date to periods of lower sea level, hinting at coastal cultures erased by post-glacial flooding. Even the seemingly unrelated culture of ancient Britain offers faint correspondences. Stonehenge's final phase, around 2000 BCE, incorporates precise astronomical alignments and bluestones transported over hundreds of kilometers, an engineering feat requiring organization and knowledge not unlike that needed to move massive blocks for Atlantean temples or to carve orichalcum pillars. The nearby site of Dennington Walls reveals a large settlement linked to Stonehenge by avenues and timber circles, suggesting seasonal gatherings on a scale that implies advanced social coordination. Meanwhile, submerged forests and Mesolithic settlements off the coast of Wales and Cornwall testify to lands inhabited before the post-glacial transgression. Could memories of more advanced maritime culture, carried by boat people along now-vanished coastlines, have influenced the megalithic builders of northwest Europe? The idea is speculative, yet the sudden appearance of megalithic traditions across Western Europe around 4000 to 3000 BCE, seemingly without gradual local evolution in many areas, continues to provoke discussion. These parallels, geometric cities, flood heroes, astronomical temples, maritime prowess, do not constitute proof of a single lost civilization. They may simply reflect convergent responses to similar environmental and social pressures, the need to manage water after rapid climatic shifts, the impulse to mark celestial events in stone, the advantages of coastal trade before rising seas severed old routes. But their cumulative presence, appearing in widely separated regions within a few millennia of Plato's 9600 BC benchmark, creates a pattern too suggestive to ignore entirely. It is as though, after a great disruption, fragments of older knowledge were scattered like seeds in the wind, taking root wherever conditions allowed. Some sprouted into new civilizations, others withered or were overgrown by later cultures. Atlantis, in this view, becomes less a place and more a moment, a threshold when humanity first tasted complex society on a grand scale, only to see it swept away, leaving survivors to begin again with whatever they could carry in memory and skill. Plato himself may have sensed this deeper layer. By setting the story 9,000 years before his time, he placed it beyond the reach of living memory, yet within the span of human possibility. By attributing it to Egyptian priests, he invoked the one culture's audience acknowledged as older and more reliable than their own. And by leaving the Critias unfinished, he allowed the tale to remain open, a vessel into which each generation could pour its own questions about origins, hubris, and resilience. Was he preserving a genuine historical kernel, adapting older myths to philosophical ends, or both at once? The ambiguity is part of the power. It keeps us listening, keeps us turning the pages of time, searching for the next clue beneath the surface. Now the current carries us still deeper. The darkness beneath the waves is not absolute. Faint bioluminescence flickers here and there, small lights that hint at life persisting where none should. In the same way, the legend of Atlantis flickers on, dim yet enduring, through sonar anomalies, pollen records of sudden landscape change, linguistic oddities, and the stubborn recurrence of flood and rebirth motifs. Each piece is small, each explanation partial, yet together they form a constellation that refuses to fade entirely. As the night stretches onward and the voice grows softer, almost a murmur against the quiet tide, the invitation remains. Stay with the story a little longer. Let the questions settle like fine silt. Somewhere in the layers still lies the shape of what was, waiting to be glimpsed not in certainty, but in the patient act of looking. The quiet persistence of these scattered fragments begins to feel almost deliberate, as though the past has chosen to speak in whispers rather than shouts, testing our patience, our willingness to listen without demanding immediate answers. We have traced the outline of a civilization that rose in splendor and fell in thunder, yet the story refuses to conclude neatly. Instead, it lingers in the margins, in the unexplained precision of certain ancient structures, in the sudden appearances of advanced techniques across disconnected lands, in the recurring dream of a golden age drowned beneath rising waters. These are not loud proofs. They are soft insistences, the kind that grows stronger the longer one remains attentive. And so we descend further still, into regions where archaeology meets legend, where the line between what can be measured and what can only be felt begins to blur. One of the most intriguing threads concerns the knowledge of astronomy and its application in sacred architecture. Plato describes the central temple of Poseidon as oriented toward the cardinal directions, its proportions reflecting cosmic harmony, its interior adorned with representations of celestial phenomena. Similar preoccupations appear in sites far older and more widespread than conventional timelines allow. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars are arranged in circles that some researchers interpret as encoding solstitial and equinoctial alignments built by people who, according to textbook prehistory, should have possessed only rudimentary tools and no settled society. The enclosures were deliberately filled in around 8000 BC, as though to preserve them from the changing world above. Far to the south, in southern Africa, the stone circles of Nabta Playa, dated to around 1700 to 1500 BC, form what may be the world's oldest known astronomical observatory, with alignments to the summer solstice and possibly to the rising of certain stars. These early observers tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius, a practice later central to Egyptian calendrics. How did such knowledge emerge so early, in places separated by vast distances and seemingly unrelated cultural trajectories? The answer may lie in a shared inheritance from a time before the Great Melt. When sea levels were lower, coastal populations along now submerged continental shelves could have developed sophisticated navigational and calendrical systems to exploit marine resources and predict seasonal migrations. Rising waters would have forced these groups inland, carrying their star lore with them. Survivors settling near surviving highlands or river valleys might have translated portable knowledge into monumental form. Stone circles, pillar alignments, temple orientations, preserving what could no longer be practiced on the drowned plains. In this light, the elaborate astronomical alignments at later sites, Karnak in Egypt, Chichen Itza in Mexico, Newgrange in Ireland, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, begin to look less like independent inventions and more like echoes of an older tradition, refracted through local materials and beliefs. Each culture added its own layer, yet the underlying impulse remained: to anchor human time to the unchanging rhythm of the heavens, perhaps in memory of a time when such anchors were more urgently needed. Metallurgy offers another quiet continuity. Plato's orichalcum, described as a naturally occurring alloy mine from Atlantean mountains, has no exact modern equivalent, yet its properties, reddish hue, resistance to tarnish, high value, recall real alloys known from the Bronze Age and earlier. Arsenical copper, produced by smelting ores rich in arsenic, yields a metal that hardens well, polishes to a golden red sheen, and was widely used before tin bronze became dominant. Sites in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau show arsenical copper artifacts dating to the 5th and 4th millennia BC. In the Americas, copper working appeared surprisingly early among cultures around the Great Lakes and in the Andean region, with cold-hammered objects predating Old World influence by centuries. If a maritime network once linked coastal societies across the Atlantic fringe, before post-glacial flooding severed those routes, techniques for alloying and working metals could diffuse along now-lost pathways. The sudden sophistication of early metallurgy in disparate regions might then represent not parallel evolution, but the re-emergence of knowledge carried by displaced peoples. Maritime capability itself forms another persistent echo. Plato's Atlanteans commanded a navy of 1,200 warships, maintained vast harbors, and traded across oceans. Such prowess presupposes advanced shipbuilding, celestial navigation, and understanding of currents and winds. We see analogous capabilities in later cultures that appear almost fully formed. The the Minoans with their swift galleys and the Lassocratic reach, the Phoenicians who circumnavigated Africa centuries before recorded history claimed such voyages were possible, the Polynesians who settled islands separated by thousands of miles using double-hull canoes and star compasses. Even earlier, evidence of seafaring exists. Obsidian traded across the Mediterranean by 6000 BCE, human presence on Crete and Cyprus well before the Neolithic Revolution, shell middens on islands that would have required boats. During lower sea levels, island-hopping routes across the Atlantic might have been shorter and more feasible, linking Western Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Americas in ways now concealed beneath water. A disruption of that network, through inundation, climate shift, or societal collapse, could explain why such knowledge appears to restart repeatedly, each time as though rediscovered rather than newly invented. These threads, astronomy, metallurgy, navigation, converge in a pattern that suggests diffusion from a common source, or at least from a shared epoch of experimentation before the Holocene stabilized. The Younger Dryas period, with abrupt cooling possibly triggered by cosmic impact or massive meltwater discharge, may have been the fulcrum. Before it, during the Ballingallorod warming, human groups expanded into newly exposed coastal lands, developing technologies suited to rich, temperate environments. The sudden return of near-glacial conditions, followed by rapid sea level rise, would have destroyed those settlements, scattered their inhabitants, and erased their material record. What survived was carried in memory, in oral tradition, in the hands of craftsmen and navigators who rebuilt where they could. Over millennia, these fragments were reassembled into new civilizations, each believing itself the first to achieve such heights, unaware of predecessors whose works now lay beneath the waves. Plato, gathering these echoes through Solon's Egyptian conduit, shaped them into a single, coherent narrative. Not to document history in the modern sense, but to illustrate a timeless truth, that civilizations rise when they align with natural and divine order and fall when they place themselves above it. The Atlantis he described was both specific and universal, a particular place and every place that forgets its limits. By embedding the tale in a dialogue about ideal governance, he ensured it would be read not as mere antiquarian curiosity, but as living counsel. The unfinished nature of Critias only deepens the effect. The story breaks off at the moment of divine judgment, leaving the reader suspended between warning and catastrophe, compelled to complete the moral arc in their own time. As the layers of time settle ever more quietly around us, the narrative approaches its final turn. The island may be gone, its harbors filled with silt, its temples toppled into darkness, yet something of its essence endures. In alignments that still track the sun, in alloys that still gleam, in the stubborn human impulse to sail toward the horizon and ask what lies beyond. The waters have not silenced the story. They have only deepened it, giving it resonance that carries farther than any single voice could. Soon the tale will reach its last gentle curve, drawing all these threads together into one unbroken line. For now, the current holds us steady, the darkness soft and patient, inviting you to remain just a little longer as the final echoes begin to rise. The final currents draw us slowly toward the surface now, carry with them every thread we have followed through darkness and time. What began as a distant whisper in Plato's dialogues has unfolded into a vast, quiet tapestry, woven from the words of Egyptian priests, the memories of survivors, the alignment of ancient stones, the gleam of lost metals, the rise and fall of waters that reshaped the world. Atlantis is no longer merely an island that sank. It has become a mirror held up across millennia, reflecting back to us the same questions that have always haunted those who build high and dream far. How fragile is our place upon the earth? What happens when we forget the measure given to us? And what, if anything, endures when everything we have raised is taken away? In the last moments before the cataclysm, the priest told Solon, the Atlanteans stood at the height of their power, yet at the edge of ruin. Their harbors brimmed with ships from every corner they had touched. Their temples shone with gold and orichalcum, so bright it seemed to hold the fire of the sun itself. Their laws, once sacred, had become instruments of control. The 10 kings still manned the great precinct, still drank from the sacred cup, still swore upon the pillars, but the oaths rang hollow. The air grew thick with the scent of incense, offered not in reverence but in desperation. Outside the concentric rings, the people waited, sensing the change without naming it. Children played in the shadow of walls that had never known breach. Farmers tended fields irrigated by canals dug by hands long dead. Elephants moved slowly through groves heavy with fruit. Life continued as it always had, because no one yet believed it could end. Then the first tremor came, not violent at first, but deep, as though the island itself had sighed. Cups trembled on tables. Birds rose in sudden flocks. The springs bubbled hotter than memory allowed. The kings looked at the priests, who looked at the sky, but the sky gave no answer. Another shock followed, stronger. Cracks appeared in marble courtyards. Statues swayed on their pedestals. The people began to run, though no one knew where safety might lie on an island surrounded by sea. The earth groaned louder. Towers leaned. Bridges snapped. The concentric moats, once serene pathways for pleasure barges, became churning torrents as water surged upward from unseen fissures. Flames licked at fallen timbers where lightning struck or where hearts overturned. The harbor walls crumbled, letting the ocean pour in like an invited guest who had waited too long. In that final day, the island seemed to fight its own descent. Mountains split and slid into valleys. Rivers reversed, carrying silt and stone toward the center instead of the sea. The great temple of Poseidon stood longest, its golden roof catching the last light before the waves reached it. Then the sea rose, not gradually, but in a single, inexorable lift. It swept over the outer ring, then the next, then the innermost. Ships still moored in the harbors were lifted and smashed against one another. The people who had crowded the highest places were carried away in the flood. No cry rose above the roar of water and earth. The island folded inward, collapsing upon itself as though pulled down by a hand from below. In a single night, the place where an empire had reigned vanished beneath the surface. Mud and debris settled over palaces and plains alike. The sea smoothed itself, indifferent, as though nothing remarkable had occurred. For a long time afterward, the site remained unmarked except by the occasional bubble rising from depths where heat still lingered, or by strange drifts of pumice that floated for years. Sailors learned to steer wide of the area, speaking of it only in low voices when the watch changed at midnight. Yet the story did not die with the island. It traveled with those few who escaped, perhaps on small boats launched in the final hours, perhaps carried in memory by traders who had left earlier. It reached the Nile Delta, where scribes recorded among other chronicles of vanished peoples. It reached the Aegean, where poets shaped it into song before writing existed. It reached Plato, who gave it form and purpose, turning personal ruin into universal caution. And so the tale has come down to us, carried across more than 2,000 years since he said in writing, carried further still from the time it first happened. We hear it now in the quiet hours, when the world outside is still, and the only sound is the soft rhythm of breath or the distant murmur of waves against some unseen shore. Atlantis reminds us that no achievement is permanent, no favor guaranteed, no height unreachable by the forces that shaped the world long before we arrived. It speaks of balance lost and consequences paid, yet also speaks of endurance, of knowledge that outlives stone and gold, of questions that refuse to be buried, of the human capacity to remember even what has been taken away. We have walked this path together, step by slow step, through layers of earth and memory, through floods and fires, through silence and whisper. What remains is not certainty. There is no single ruin that bears a name, no artifact stamped with proof, but something subtler and perhaps more enduring, the recognition that we are part of the same long story, heirs to the same warnings, dreamers of the same dreams. The island may lie 2 miles down in cold darkness, its spires broken, its gardens silent, but the idea of it rises again and again, gentle yet insistent, asking us to look at our own cities, our own ambitions, our own measure, and to wonder how long they will stand. If you enjoyed this journey through history, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves the past, and subscribe to the channel for more long-form historical stories like this.